Be kind of very stupid to announce the end of the profession of architecture in Brasilia. And I don't think we are facing the end of the architect. What I think is more like, first of all, architects were always responsible for a very small percentage of building. So I don't think that the situation is not fundamentally different from the way it was. But I think that I wrote, and maybe I introduce here a little bit of history. I started studying in '68 when I was 25. I finished my studies at 30, and then I went to New York and wrote a book about New York, and writing that book took me 6 years. So I wrote a book about New York because I wanted to show that I wanted to investigate really that the way architects, whether the way architects think about the city or consider the city, largely in formal terms or in terms of the repertoire of the architect, which is to create coherence, to use axes, to think about symmetry, and to think about composition. Whether that kind of essential repertoire of the architect was still relevant or interesting in the face of a city like New York, where you can tell that completely different issues are really much more important. And also considering that certain inventions of the modern time, particularly the elevator, for instance, which connects almost randomly any floor, and therefore makes the whole idea of composition completely useless. Whether basically those modern inventions, the elevator, the steel structure, air conditioning, which can kind of extend the scale of a building also infinitely, and which in a way cuts off the connection between the inside and the outside of the building. So I was really writing this book to do two things at the same time: to try to define a new agenda for architecture, which was not nostalgic and not maintaining the traditional values of architecture, which would be able to think about these new inventions and their impact on architecture. And I was also particularly fascinated in a city like New York, how much of modernity there was not imposed by some kind of avant-garde, an avant-garde artist, an avant-garde architect, or an avant-garde politicians, but seemed to somehow be a spontaneous movement that came, so to speak, from below. So there were two things I wanted to do to redefine the agenda of architecture, but also to recognize, perhaps, that in the future and with New York, from New York onwards, an avant-garde would no longer be in charge of conceptualizing the city, but that the other forces would dominate. So after New York, I maintained a kind of really very intense interest, particularly in the notion of how the city was evolving. And that seemed to be necessary because, as everybody knows now, larger and larger percentage of the general population of mankind is moving towards cities. The cliche is now to say that kind of over 50% of people live in the cities. And basically through this movement, which is perhaps most visible in Asia, through this movement, the nature of the city changes very radically in itself. And kind of rather than saying that the architect has no role in that, or in defining the city, it is clear that the movement is happening at such an incredible speed. The scale is so enormous and radical and unprecedented that our profession as we currently think it, is simply not capable in defining kind of strategies to work within it. So that is really what has been my entire work, you could say, is to look at what the nature of this evolution is, and then to define how our profession can accommodate and deal with that acceleration. So I've looked at it in America, I've looked at cities like Atlanta, I've looked in China and Asia in general, of course, but we have looked in Africa, and everywhere we see the same kind of phenomenon of a movement seemingly out of control, confronted with a profession that is still, in the first instance, thinking of itself as being able to impose. I think it's a very good question, and it's also a fundamental question which is in a way separate from myself. Namely, the question is, if you do two things, on the one hand, you have a certain theoretical interest, and in the other hand, you're also a practicing architect, to what extent does one have to translate or represent to what extent does your architecture have to represent your theories? And I have never felt responsible or obliged to really be the illustrator of my theories. And I also think that particularly the New York book was very ingenious, because it did not write a prospective theory. It did not kind of announce how people had to behave in the future. But it actually looked in retrospect and made a theory out of things that already had happened and that had happened without theory. So in that sense, it would have been impossible to be the illustration of anything related to Delirious New York. At the same time, I would say that there are certain buildings that we would never have been able to do without first having done the kind of theoretical work on Delirious New York. I think we're doing now in Beijing, in China, kind of headquarters for Central China Television. I think that building is an almost straight attempt to deal with the same problematic, the same potentials, the same. And of course, it's doing it in a different way from New York, but I think that is kind of very straightforward kind of relationship. There are other buildings which we do that deliberately have nothing to do with any idea of congestion. And I would also say that in any case, but this is more an assessment of, let's say, a cultural critic, is that the idea, the enthusiasm for the notion of congestion is diminishing, maybe at the exact moment that the urban condition is triumphant. So that could mean a number of things, but what it probably means is that now that we all live in cities, the whole idea of intensity is not exactly very inspiring anymore, and we are kind of looking at strategies to be alone, or at least to relax within those conditions.
Thoughts, perceptions of word of architecture. And finally, if you would have any inspiring phrase or advice to give us. Thank you.
Well, of course, it's very difficult for me to know or to have a good sense of what the current mentality in Brazil is for architecture students. But perhaps what I noticed in the the strongest thing I noticed in, let's say, in terms of my generation and later and current generations of architects, architecture students, and of course we have a kind of very intense experience because the office itself is really largely manned and staffed by people of your generation, or slightly older, but not a lot older. Which is actually one of the interesting things about architecture, that it's always co-production of different generations. But what for me is the most noticeable difference is that our generation was not afraid to waste time. And it seems that the current generation is unbelievably linear and wants to, in a kind of shortest possible kind of time, to achieve its goals and become a kind of professional. I can say, as I mentioned, I started studying architecture at 25, then went to America at 30, wrote a book till 36. I was only 40 when I actually started to think about making architecture seriously. And I think, in retrospect, that is a kind of enormous kind of reservoir of having thought and looked at different things, having looked at things differently, and in a way not worried about this kind of very, under certain circumstances, very narrowing kind of thing which is architectural practice. It's kind of really sometimes highly claustrophobic in terms of all the issues that you have to eliminate in order to really achieve a successful building. So it's kind of really that particular thing which I would say is really very crucial. Do you have another thing you could add to that?
If I look at your story, you were first a journalist and scriptwriter. So I think when I look at Rem's work and the team he works with, and we are part of the team in the sense that we are one of those satellites working with OLA. There's also engineers and designers and artists and philosophers and writers. I mean, there are always many people working with OLA as part of their think process or view or analysis. But Rem himself has done other jobs or other things like journalism and scriptwriting, and I think you see that very much in his work. So the curiosity and also the sense of humor, how you create scenarios within a building. How it will be used, what happens in these rooms, corridors, elevators, sports fields, whatever. If you imagine that, then you make a whole different kind of architecture. So I would say, also from my point of view, curiosity and sense of humor, an interest in the human being and interaction between nationalities and generations